Through every generation of the human race, there has been a constant war, a war with fear. Those who conquer it are made free. Those who succumb suffer, until fear becomes their death. Alexander the Great, taught to conquer worlds, driven by ambition and terror alike, knew this war intimately. He conquered not just nations, but the darkness in human hearts. Tonight, we do not praise his glory. Instead, we illuminate his shadow. Stay, watch, wonder. What price was paid for greatness when fear became his blade? Chapter 1: Thebes in Flames, a Message in Ashes. Few cities in all of history evaporated like Thebes. In 335 BC, just as Alexander the Great readied his eastern campaign, the city dared to revolt. The result was not a siege, but a holocaust. Within weeks, Alexander raced south, his army covering more than 300 miles in under 2 weeks, arriving near Thebes so swiftly that its citizens thought he was Antipater, not the king himself. He offered leniency, unconditional surrender in exchange for handing over the revolt's leaders. A mercy clause, shattered by Theban defiance. They demanded Alexander submit one of his own generals to them. Then, under the ghostly glow of torches and the resounding clash of weapons, the city fell. Annihilation followed. 6,000 were slain, 30,000 sold into slavery. Homes, streets, hopes all burned to ash. Only the temples, the citadel of Cadmea, and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, an eerie act of preservation amid ruin. No plea softened the retribution. Slaves, women, children, we speak not of heroic sacrifice, but of domination made real. Lands were divided among Boeotian allies, the city wailed its final cry, and its territory shattered into nothingness. Imagine standing amid the ashes. Can you sense the heat? The shock of emptiness. A message written not in ink, but in fire, blood, and broken stone. Defy me and be forgotten. This wasn't slaughter for necessity. It was terror as art, a warning to every Greek city that dreams of defiance. And yet, this was merely the beginning of the darkness to come. What happens when the terror Alexander used on entire cities turns inward, within his closest circle? Chapter 2: Gaza, Cruelty as Spectacle. After Thebes left only ashes behind, Alexander's shadow turned toward the south, to Gaza, perched stubbornly on a desert edge. Its walls stood 60 feet high, a bleak barrier between him and the fertile lands of Egypt. The city's commander, Battus, refused to yield, expecting reinforcements under Darius III, and daring the young king to break him. So Alexander laid siege. For 2 brutal months, he and his engineers toiled. Ramparts built, siege engines piled high, relentless attempts to breach those unforgiving walls. Arrian tells us it took 3 failed assaults before the Macedonians finally stormed in, and Alexander himself was wounded, a bolt piercing his shoulder, an intimate price paid on the threshold of vengeance. When the walls finally fell, the carnage began. Men were put to the sword. Women and children sold into slavery. A city's worth of lives scattered and broken. And then the act that would stain memory. Battus, the proud commander, executed in grotesque imitation of myth. According to Quintus Curtius Rufus, a rope was forced between his ankles, likely between the tendon and bone, and he was dragged behind a chariot beneath the city walls alive until he died. Alexander, enraged by Battus's refusal to kneel and his steadfast contempt, chose vengeance over mercy and turned the siege into a spectacle of terror. Stand back. Try to imagine the horror on those faces. Fear not born of defeat, but of spectacle, of deliberate theatrical agony. And with Gaza silenced and Egypt now within his grasp, he marched onward. But contemporary records, Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus, say nothing of this atrocity. Was it too grotesque? Or too true? His supporters buried it, while his enemies whispered it in the dark. A city brought to its knees. A commander's death turned into legend, murder masquerading as myth. But cruelty like this doesn't stay at city gates. Before long, it would enter palace halls. Chapter 3: Trust Eroded, Executions from Within. After Gaza's walls echoed with agony, Alexander's triumph seemed unstoppable. But conquest had a cost, not only in shattered cities, but in trust. When suspicion whispers inside palace walls, its victims are the closest, and often the most loyal. In 330 BC, a chilling conspiracy surfaced, not against a city, but against Alexander himself. His trusted cavalry commander, Philotas, son of the great general Parmenion, found himself accused of knowing of a plot to kill the king, and failing to report it. At first, Alexander hesitated. Perhaps he saw in Philotas the image of loyalty, the right arm of victories on the Granicus, Issus, and Tyre. But defiance lingered in the air. Craterus and Caenus, commanders of the phalanx, renewed the charges the next day. Despite his hesitation, Alexander convened a trial before the assembled Macedonian army, capital jurisdiction invoked, the accusation betrayal. Under torture, Philotas confessed to being aware of the conspiracy and was condemned. The soldiers, resentful of his arrogance no less than his alleged treachery, stoned him to death. Alexander did not pause. He dispatched a courier ahead to Ecbatana. He knew his father, Parmenion, must die to eliminate any threat to the throne. Even though Parmenion had been a loyal and experienced commander, Alexander ensured he would never know why. The executioners awaited his arrival and ended not just a life, but the legacy of a lineage too powerful to be left standing. This was no military necessity. It was terror made intimate, a ruling made with blood and fear cast inward. In one swift, silent moment, the pillars of Alexander's loyalty collapsed. Imagine the weight that settled across the camp. No commander was safe, not even those who stood beside him in battle. Alexander's empire was built on fear, fear of enemies and fear of friends. Power had become poisoned by paranoia, and soon that poison would taste of blood, shared not with enemies but with friends. The next act of betrayal would come not from whispers amid dissent, but from cries across a banquet table. Chapter 4: Clitus the Black, a Friendship Murdered. Amidst the opulence of Maracanda, Alexander the Great sat at the head of a grand banquet, celebrating his conquests and the expansion of his empire. The air was thick with the scent of spiced wine and roasted meats, the clamor of revelry echoing through the hall. Yet, beneath the surface of merriment, a storm was brewing. Clitus the Black, once a steadfast companion and savior of Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus, now found himself at odds with his king. The Macedonian general had been appointed satrap of Bactria, a post far removed from the heart of Alexander's campaigns. To Clitus, this assignment was a demotion, a relegation to the periphery of the empire's affairs. As the night wore on and the wine flowed freely, the conversation turned to matters of legacy. Alexander, emboldened by drink, began to boast of his achievements, comparing them to those of his father, King Philip II. He claimed that his deeds surpassed those of his father, that he had surpassed the very man who had laid the foundations of Macedonian power. Clitus, his patience worn thin by the king's arrogance, retorted sharply. He reminded Alexander that it was Philip who had built the empire, and that Alexander's successes were but the continuation of his father's work. The words stung, and the atmosphere shifted from celebration to tension. In a fit of rage, Alexander ordered his guards to seize Clitus. The room fell silent as the king's fury became apparent. But the guards hesitated, torn between their loyalty to the king and their respect for Clitus. Seizing the moment, Clitus broke free and fled the hall. Yet, the quarrel was far from over. Clitus returned, defiant and unyielding, continuing his rebuke of Alexander's arrogance. In a blind rage, Alexander grabbed a javelin and hurled it at Clitus. The weapon struck true and Clitus fell, mortally wounded. The hall erupted into chaos. Alexander, realizing the gravity of his actions, collapsed in despair. He had killed his friend, his savior, in a moment of drunken fury. The weight of the deed crushed him, and he withdrew from the revelry, consumed by guilt and sorrow. The death of Clitus was not just the loss of a man, It was the shattering of a bond forged in battle. It was a testament to the corrosive power of unchecked ambition and the fragility of trust. In his quest for glory, Alexander had destroyed the very foundation of his strength, his relationships with those who had stood by him. But the death of Clitus was but a prelude to the darkness that awaited. For in the wake of his friend's murder, Alexander's mind began to unravel. Paranoia took root, and the once great conqueror found himself surrounded by enemies, real and imagined. The empire he had built began to fracture, not from external foes, but from the seeds of distrust he had sown within his own ranks. Chapter 5: The Collapse of the Empire. With the death of Clitus the Black, Alexander's soul was shattered, and the empire he had forged began to unravel. The once unified Macedonian army, bound by loyalty and shared purpose, now found itself fractured by suspicion, fear, and the corrosive effects of unchecked power. The king's increasing adoption of Persian customs, once a source of pride, had become a point of contention. The Macedonian soldiers, who had followed Alexander across continents, now questioned his decisions. The introduction of proskynesis, the Persian practice of bowing before royalty, was met with resistance. To the Macedonian mind, it was a degradation, a betrayal of their warrior ethos. Rumors swirled through the ranks. Whispers of Alexander's erratic behavior, his increasing isolation, and his harsh punishments for perceived disloyalty spread like wildfire. The once heroic figure was now seen by many as a tyrant, a man who had lost touch with the very people who had elevated him to greatness. The empire, vast and sprawling, became increasingly difficult to govern. Distant provinces, once loyal, began to rebel. The satraps, regional governors appointed by Alexander, grew more autonomous, their allegiance to the king weakening. The unity that had characterized the Macedonian conquests was beginning to fray. In 324 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon, intending to make it the new capital of his empire. He envisioned a city that would rival the great cities of the world, a center of learning and culture. But the reality was far different. The city was plagued by disease, and the infrastructure was inadequate. The grand plans for Babylon were never realized. Amidst these challenges, Alexander's health began to deteriorate. He fell ill, and rumors of poisoning circulated. Some believed that his generals, fearing his increasing paranoia and erratic behavior, had conspired to end his life. Others thought it was the culmination of years of relentless campaigning and the toll it had taken on his body. As Alexander lay on his deathbed, the empire he had built began to crumble. His generals, once united under his command, now vied for power. The unity that had propelled them to victory was gone, replaced by ambition and greed. When Alexander died in 323 BC, he left behind a fractured empire. His dream of a unified world under Macedonian rule was shattered. The empire was divided among his generals, known as the Diadochi, who fought among themselves for control. The once mighty empire, built on the foundation of conquest and unity, had collapsed into chaos and division. But even in death, Alexander's legacy was not secure. The empire he left behind was a fractured mosaic, each piece vying for dominance. The Diadochi, his former companions, would soon turn on each other, leading to wars that would further splinter the empire. And amidst this chaos, a question lingered. Was Alexander's vision of a unified world truly achievable, or was it doomed from the start? Chapter 6: The Legacy of Empire. Alexander the Great's empire, once a beacon of ambition and conquest, now lay in ruins. His vision of a unified world under Macedonian rule had crumbled, fragmented by internal strife and the relentless ambitions of his generals. Yet, in the ashes of his empire, the embers of his legacy continued to burn. The successor states, or Hellenistic kingdoms, that emerged from the division of Alexander's empire became centers of cultural exchange and innovation. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedon each carried forward elements of Greek culture. blending them with local traditions to create a rich tapestry of art, philosophy, and science. In Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander himself, the great library became a symbol of the pursuit of knowledge. Scholars from across the known world gathered there, preserving and expanding upon the works of earlier civilizations. The blending of Greek and Eastern thought during this period laid the groundwork for future intellectual advancements. Despite the political fragmentation, the spread of Greek language and culture, known as Hellenization, left an indelible mark on the regions once under Alexander's control. Cities bearing Greek names, with Greek-speaking populations, dotted the landscape from Egypt to India. This cultural diffusion facilitated trade, communication, and the exchange of ideas, fostering a cosmopolitan world that transcended traditional boundaries. Yet, the empire's collapse also served as a cautionary tale. The lack of a clear succession plan, the overextension of resources, and the unchecked ambitions of his generals highlighted the vulnerabilities inherent in such a vast empire. Alexander's failure to establish a stable administrative framework and to secure a competent heir led to the rapid disintegration of his life's work. In the centuries that followed, the lessons of Alexander's empire resonated with future rulers. The rise of Rome, with its emphasis on governance, law, and infrastructure, contrasted sharply with the fleeting nature of Alexander's conquests. The Roman Empire, while not without its own challenges, would endure for centuries, learning from the mistakes of its predecessors. Alexander's empire may have fallen, but the world it shaped endured. The cultural and intellectual legacies of the Hellenistic period continued to influence civilizations for generations. In the end, the story of Alexander the Great is not just one of conquest and ambition, but of the enduring impact of cultural exchange and the complexities of empire. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you found this exploration insightful, why not continue the adventure with us? Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to stay updated on our latest content. Your support helps us bring more stories to life. Have thoughts or questions? Drop them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep wondering.